Welcome everyone to another CASA webinar as part of our pilot safety campaign. My name's Tim Penny. I'm an aviation safety advisor and I work with CASA down here in the Melbourne office. And we're fortunate today to have a couple of guest presenters from industry who are more than willing to share their expertise with us today. I'd like to introduce Marty Peters. Marty is the Assistant Head of Flight Operations for RAOS, or Recreational Aviation Australia, and Marty is joining us from Newcastle. Also alongside Marty is Chris Magnay. Chris is a check pilot with one of the largest GA operators in the country, based up in the northwest corner of Australia, up in Kununurra. Chris is with Aviation, and we're certainly happy for Chris to drop in and share his expertise with us as well today. So this is a further webinar in our pilot safety campaign series, and we're still looking at the topic of operations in non-controlled airspace, and we certainly do appreciate the fact that you've all joined us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be. Just a few bits and pieces about the rules of engagement and welcome and housekeeping, etc., before we get underway. Thanks so much for joining us. We certainly really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time. This webinar will certainly be a short and sharp webinar, like all of them, because we understand, of course, that people's attention spans are limited when staring at a screen, and everyone's time is quite precious. And we certainly want this experience to be as useful as possible for you. The other things we want to just quickly let people know about is we've turned off your cameras and microphones, if that's okay at this stage, because there are lots and lots of people on the webinar. If those cameras and microphones on, it can be quite distracting for people that are presenting. But however, you will notice on the top of your screen there's a little chat bubble. And if you click on that chat bubble, it will open a window on the right-hand side of your screen. And as we go through the presentation today, you're more than welcome to type in any questions or comments that you have. And we certainly hope to get through some of those towards the end of our presentation before we run out of time. And any questions, of course, that we don't get round to, we'll certainly follow up with you in the coming days. So all those questions do get attended to. The webinar is being recorded because we do put these webinars up on our website so people can make use of them further down the track. So just wanted to mention that. And finally, as I said before, please feel free to type any questions that you may have or comment in that chat window, and we'll certainly do our best to address those as we go or afterwards. But today's presentation is really to give all of us an appreciation of some of the different challenges that VFR and IFR pilots face, and how an understanding of what other pilots have to deal with can help us work in better with the other aircraft in our vicinity. And we're certainly grateful for our guest speakers being with us today. I think that's about it for the welcome and housekeeping. It's our aim, as usual, to have all of this done and dusted in about 45 minutes or so, because we know people's time is precious. So the agenda, a quick overview. I'll lead off with a quick overview about the topic and why we're doing this. And then really it's the majority of our presentation this afternoon will be in the hands of our guest presenters, Chris and Marty. Marty, as I said, is from RAOS, and Chris is from Aviation up in Kununurra joining us. Then I'll just wrap up with a few key points, and then we'll have time for some questions and discussion, hopefully at the end. So that's the agenda. That's where we're kind of going with our webinar today. So just to introduce the topic, a little bit of an overview. In our pilot safety campaign, we've spoken at length about some of the hazards of operating in the non-controlled environment. And one of the issues that always tends to generate a lot of discussion and comment at seminars and around the traps is how VFR and IFR operations can operate safely alongside each other. Not just the way aircraft might navigate from A to B, but a whole host of other things. So non-controlled airspace, of course, presents a number of hazards, and one of those is the traffic mix. Different traffic has different terminologies and phraseologies, as we're all aware of. You know, for the VFR pilot, for example, what on earth is an initial approach fix? And for the IFR pilot, you know, where on earth is, for example, Targa Gap? It's actually a VFR approach point inbound to Launceston. But the other thing about operating in this world is not only different terminologies, but also different flight paths, approach and departure profiles. They can be significantly different. Everything from straight in approaches, instrument approaches, or standard circuit entries. The other thing that can be different between VFR and IFR aircraft is different aircraft performance. IFR aircraft do tend to be faster in the circuit than VFR aircraft. And there are hazards, of course, and risks that need to be negotiated and managed with that. Perhaps also even different expectations. Commercial operators flying IFR versus private and recreational pilots flying just for fun. Everything from how they enter the circuit to the impact of things like traffic and delays all play a role in impacting on how we work in with each other in that environment. But risk management, of course, requires an appreciation of the challenges faced by other pilots because we don't all fly in a bubble. We can, of course, all of us can on occasions get caught up in our own little world. But it is good practice to at least take the opportunity every now and then to put yourself in the other pilot's shoes. So getting that appreciation of the challenges faced by the other pilots you share the air with, because at the end of the day, we all share the same airspace. Other things I just want to quickly mention, really the big question is how do we integrate VFR and IFR traffic safely in a non-controlled airspace, both en route and within the airport environment? That's the big challenge. How do we play in the same sandpit in a safe and harmonious manner without annoying each other or hurting each other? That's where we really want to be. Many VFR pilots, of course, don't have an understanding of the IFR world and some of the challenges faced by IFR pilots, and Chris is going to give us some information on this. But also on the VFR side of the house, many IFR pilots, they may have also perhaps forgotten some of the early challenges faced in their career before they got their instrument ratings and some of the challenges faced by the VFR pilot. And of course, VFR and IFR pilots aren't expected to know everything about each other's operations. You know, let's be real here, but risk management would certainly be enhanced if VFR pilots could perhaps learn to appreciate some of the challenges faced by their IFR cousins. And IFR pilots would also benefit by taking time every now and then to just reflect on some of the issues they perhaps once had when they were flying VFR, because it certainly can be really easy to forget. And we're not there, of course, we're not here to host a standoff between VFR and IFR pilots. And I've done many seminars where the topic of VFR and IFR sharing the same airspace can, of course, generate some strong opinions. But we're certainly not here to take sides. We don't want pilots at 10 paces with their pistols drawn. But a little bit of understanding of the challenges faced by each party and what each group of pilots could do for the other to make things safer would certainly be a really good result. So without further ado, I will now ask Chris up in Kununurra to take control of the presentation and run us through, from his perspective as a professional IFR pilot, some of the issues that they have faced and maybe some hints and tips that we can all take and apply to our own flying. So over to you, Chris, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate being asked to come along and contribute today, and thanks for everyone for tuning in too. It's great to see so many people looking to develop their skills and working out how we can all work together well. Uncontrolled aerodromes.
You're on mute, Chris.
Thanks, Tim. Thought I hit the button. Appreciate that. Thanks for inviting me along today, Tim, and also for that introduction. And thanks for everyone for turning up as well and participating in the webinar today. Hopefully, get a little bit of insight and understanding, and leave being a little bit safer in their operations together. Just a quick background about me. I won't give too much information, but
You're mute again, Chris.
Space bars are a killer for me. Anyway, I live up in Canada, which is between Brisbane, and I've been pretty fortunate to be here for the last 20 years, and had some really good flying roles. Starting off with VFR, and moving up to the check and training role that I'm in today. Been chief pilot a few times as well over the year. Yeah, I've operated a mix of aircraft, got plenty of 210 time and other singles, and plenty of time in turbines, and also fortunate to fly small jet around up out of the Kimberley now as well. Currently work as a check and training pilot with Aviation, so pretty fortunate to spend a lot of time with other pilots, and that's a pretty rewarding part of my role, and also get to see a lot of private pilots and uncontrolled aerodromes. It's mostly where we fly. So I've got to be a fly on the wall for that mix of traffic for quite a number of years. And yeah, generally it all works pretty well. So that's probably enough about me. And just what I want to have a quick chat about today is just to give people a basic overview of what it's like as an IFR pilot at a CTAF, an uncontrolled aerodrome. Have a quick chat about some of the areas where there could be potential conflicts, and then a few solutions on how we might be able to work together to make it a safe airspace. I'm going to just quickly have a chat about how IFR pilots will normally arrive in the circuit. Most of the time when we're out flying, it's going to be visual conditions, and we'll just do a standard visual circuit. Generally, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the circuit's direction is going to be. We'll try and get the weather well before our top of descent, and we've planned our arrival, and it'll be normally a direct entry into the circuit. You know, we're certainly cognizant of the costs involved in operating our aircraft, and we're just trying to be as efficient as possible. There's times when we have visual conditions where we might actually choose to do an instrument approach, and there could be a number of reasons why we're doing that. Could be for safety, helps us with traffic flow. It might be a more efficient way of arriving in the circuit. Certainly currency is something that we'll have to think about, and we've had, like we do up here in Canada, have pretty significant periods of blue skies, so we're not having to shoot a few approaches just to make sure that we're still current. And then there's also quite a lot of training that goes on for multi-engine and single-engine IFR flying. But even in visual conditions, if we're practicing instrument approaches, we can be working pretty hard, and that could be from training or checking, or it could just be single pilot operations. The pilots under training may also be under simulated instrument conditions, so flying under the hood, and certainly that increases someone's workload and their ability, obviously, to spot traffic. Hopefully, they're simulating instrument conditions with another pilot, otherwise we're all in trouble. But it's certainly something to be aware of if someone's practicing an approach that they may not have the they might be working pretty hard, and it might be up to the training or checking pilot to be the lookout. And then we also have times where we're doing approaches because of poor weather. It doesn't mean that it's right down to minima. It could just be the most efficient way and the safest way for us to arrive in the circuit. It tends to be quite a high workload phase of flight when we are working in poorer weather. It also makes lookout a lot more difficult when visibility or cloud base is an issue for us. And there's probably a couple of different types of approaches that we can do, and we'll go through probably the more typical ones, but they might be runway aligned, or they might be descending out to one side of the airfield or the other in a reversal procedure.
Chris, I just want to emphasise at this point that, especially in the GA world, a lot of IFR flying is single pilot. So when you're flying single pilot, the workload itself has increased even more, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is, Tim. So yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit now, just with some of the challenges of the IFR pilots. But yeah, certainly when you're by yourself, the workload is pretty significant. There's certain phases of our flight which will probably be considered high workloads. Certainly, whenever we're departing below a safe altitude. That could be the grid lower safe or the aerodrome MSA. We're working pretty hard to make sure that we're monitoring, following our flight path that we've decided is the safe way to depart the aerodrome. Typically, it'll be overhead if the weather's poor, or it could be following a steps, or you could depart upwind depending on the performance of the aircraft. But we're certainly pretty busy monitoring our flight path when we're departing. When we get pretty busy approaching that type of descent, we'll generally have a plan for our arrival. We'll assess the weather to make sure that either we need to do a visual approach or we'll be required to do an instrument approach. Around the start of the approach, it's typically about 15 miles from the aerodrome. We need to make sure that all our checklists are completed and the aircraft's configured. So it tends to be a little bit of a head down work at that point of the arrival. And so we certainly get pretty busy. And then once we get onto final approach, we're monitoring our flight path, and certainly the ability for us to monitor outside the aircraft is a little bit more limited. Certainly monitoring traffic is something that we're pretty cognizant of at that phase as well.
Marty, did you want to jump in there with a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of say, Chris, it's an interesting thing when a VFR person starts to understand a bit of a high workload. Once you start rattling these little key items off, it can put us in our mindset of what you're going through. And I know shortly the viewers are going to see what an approach place looks like. So they'll start to get that understanding of that high workload. That was all.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. One thing that is probably pretty good to keep in mind as well, it certainly becomes a bit of an issue in high traffic aerodromes, is that an IFR pilot might not always get back to you straight away on the radios, and they might ask you to repeat something. And it's generally because there's two radios that are going at the same time, and we're monitoring air traffic control or area frequencies, and they might be passing along IFR traffic to us, or it could be updated weather, it could be a number of things that we're having to monitor two radios at the same time. So just be mindful of that. And if you think someone has missed an important call, just make sure you pop up and say, oh, well, look, did you copy my last transmission? I'm just inbound as well, and this is my circuit time. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, just in case they've missed a radio call, that could be quite important. Traffic separation is probably quite a big part of the IFR pilot's role, and we'll have a quick look at an instrument approach on the next slide. But we could be fairly well committed to our approach path from some distance out, and trying to time that with traffic that's already in the circuit or approaching the circuit can be pretty important. So we'll try and manage that traffic from quite some distance out to time our arrival. We'll put some other strategies in place just to make sure that it's not going to be a conflict once we get down to the circuit area.
Yes, with that, are you given known traffic on your arrival there if there are VFR in that vicinity?
Yeah, great question. It certainly depends on what aerodrome you're flying at. A lot of that known traffic comes from ADS-B, which requires coverage at the aerodrome. Up here in the Kimberley, there's not many aerodromes where we have ADS-B coverage in the circuit. So we're unlikely to get that information from ATC. If you're operating some of the busier parts of the country and it could be radar identified, that certainly might get some of that traffic from ATC, but it generally is as it's available and workload dependent on the controller as well as the pilot, whether or not that'll come through. So it's not guaranteed that it'll come through, but certainly if they can pass on information that's relevant, they will. And I guess I quickly just touch on some of those limitations. We'll just talk a little bit about some of the ADS-B limitations, and it has to have coverage. What you can see on flight radar is not everything that the controllers will be able to see. Their network's a little bit smaller than what flight radar is. A lot of aircraft these days have TCAS, like the bigger jets, and TCAS is pretty smart. It interrogates transponders and it'll tell someone how to fly away from another aircraft to keep them in a safe envelope. But most lighter IFR aircraft, such as the ones that we fly, King Airs, PC-12s, and that ilk, may not have TCAS, but they'll have TAS, or traffic alerting and avoidance system. It gives you information on where an aircraft is, but it won't tell you how to fly away from it. And it also won't always give you the call sign. So just because you've got ADS-B out on your aircraft, we might be able to see that there is some traffic around, but we won't necessarily know what the call sign of that traffic is or exactly what it is. And so it's got quite a few limitations there. It's certainly helpful for see and avoid, but it won't give us a safe flight path away from that traffic if it gets down to it. And then the ADS-B has limitations as to its coverage around the country. And for a large part of Australia, that's pretty limited. IFR pilots have quite a hard time when we start getting low cloud bases and visibility decreases. And that's when we really need to start planning our arrivals and departures quite carefully. And we'll have a look at a typical approach, but we can get pretty busy. And certainly one of the harder times to manage is if the cloud base is low enough that we'll have to shoot approaches to get down to circuit altitudes, but it's good enough for VFR pilots to be flying around underneath it. So you could have popping out of cloud at the same altitude that VFR aircraft are operating at. And a lot of the times, IFR aircraft are single pilots, and it certainly is pretty busy when it's only one of you at the front, having to manage everything, monitor all your systems, the flight path of the aircraft, making sure the aircraft's configured, all your checklists, 2 radios going at the same time. It can be quite a lot to manage. That's probably some of the challenges of IFR pilots. When we make our radio calls inbound and outbound of aerodromes, it's pretty good practice for IFR pilots to use plain language, talking about compass points for inbound calls. Sometimes I might get a bit busy and forget to do that, and I'll start using some terms that don't make sense to other pilots. Might be inbound via Whiskey Golf or Whiskey Echo, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'd just like to quickly run over what those terms mean, just to give you a bit of information. And the other time that might be useful is if you're listening to the area VHF and you hear someone, Brisbane Centre, giving someone a clearance, or Melbourne Centre, depending where you are, giving them a clearance to track towards Whiskey Golf or another one of the initial waypoints. So this is my home airport here in Kununurra, and it's a pretty typical GPS-based instrument approach. Just zoom in a little bit on the flight path in and out of the aerodrome, but I won't get into too much of the ins and outs, other than I'd like to point out these 3 points here. They're the initial approach fixes, and that is the start of the approach. And the whole point of those 3 waypoints is to funnel us down to put us on a straight-in approach into the aerodrome. Pretty typically, it's going to be putting us onto a 10-mile final straight in onto a runway. They're pretty complex names, KNXWG. So we typically just call that Whiskey Golf, Whiskey Echo, or Whiskey Delta. So if an IFR pilot comes in to an aerodrome and forgets that they need to talk in local language or plain language, they might talk about Whiskey Echo or Whiskey Golf. The whiskey part is just simply that it's out to the west. We'll just have a quick look at another airfield down in Kangaroo Island, and you can see we got Sierra Juliet, Sierra Golf, and Sierra Echo. That simply means that it's the southern waypoints putting us onto a 10-mile final onto runway 01.
Chris, I think that's a fantastic thing to bring to the attention to a VFR pilot, because that's what they really want to listen to, isn't it? That idea of if they're to the south or the west. So Yeah, thank you for that. And I think our VFR pilots will really absorb that and enjoy the fact that they can now know if they call up that Whiskey Golf, they're not from the east, they're coming in from the west.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. That's the main takeaway that we wanted to sort of get across with that, with those naming conventions. The other one that I'm just found here is Sierra Foxtrot, which is the final approach fix, but it is typically a 5-mile final position for the runway that's in use. So that's a 5-mile final from the south, and you'll often hear people track it direct to that waypoint there. We've got a pretty busy intersection here, and sometimes flying in the circuit feels much like trying to navigate an intersection that looks like that. So we'll just have a quick chat about some of the potential areas for conflicts, mostly surrounding arriving at an aerodrome. It tends to be a point that we all funnel into. So when we're out on route, everyone's pretty spread out, but once we arrive in a circuit, everyone's starting to get pretty close into each other. There's always a bit of issues with people doing straight-in approaches at busy aerodromes, and like I just showed you on that last slide, the instrument approaches will most likely put us straight into a straight-in approach, normally a 10-mile final onto the aerodrome. The other one that we have issues with is people entering runways, and people departing and arriving at the same aerodromes on busy routes can often be conflicting with each other. If you're transiting CTAFs, we probably don't have as much of an issue with transiting CTAFs here in the Kimberley as some of the other parts of the country, but certainly being aware of the aerodromes that you're flying around can be pretty important. And like I mentioned previously, anytime there's low cloud and low visibility, it certainly can be areas of conflict if IFR aircraft are popping out of cloud, and it can certainly, things can happen pretty quickly.
Chris,
next up, we'll just have a quick look.
Oh, sorry, can I butt in there? Chris, with your reciprocal inbound, outbound, I know a lot of VFR pilots really probably get their nose out of joint if an IFR aircraft just wants to track for straight in, and it's not the active runway when we're talking only a couple of knots. Can you sort of explain, though, why you might continue on? I assume that the flight manual would say that the aircraft can land with a couple of knots of downwind or so forth. But yeah, can you just sort of respond on that to a VFR person? You know, you might work the timing out, but it's just a case of the flow, the workload, and everything for yourself. Yeah,
generally a straight-in approach will be the safest and most efficient, lowest workload approach for an IFR pilot. And the further out that we can set that up, the better. So it might be a case that they're just trying to get organised, get lined up on the runway, and set up their 3-degree profile all the way in from a larger distance out that accept a small tailwind as a benefit rather than coming in and flying a circuit and following the pattern. When we can get stabilised further out and earlier by doing a straight-in approach. Hopefully that answered your question there, Marty.
Absolutely perfect, thanks.
Cool. So here's a quick little diagram of the circuit. Sorry about my great artistry skills. But yeah, I just thought I'd highlight a few areas in the circuit where I'm sure you've all seen these before, that you know, it might be areas that we need to manage the threat of collision. Probably the most straightforward circuit joins is either a crosswind or a downwind joint. They all seem to converge at around the same point in the circuit though. So my biggest tip for arriving in the circuit is to get your joining call out nice and early enough that someone can respond to you or take evasive action, or certainly that they might be able to increase their ability to see and avoid, or alerted see and avoid. So if you know where someone's coming from, it's a lot easier to see them. The other one I just mentioned on crosswind joins is that high-performance aircraft can reach circuit altitude fairly quickly, and it could well be around the upwind end of the runway. So we normally talk about doing midfield crosswind joins, and that's part of the reason for that is that high-performance aircraft could be certainly through the circuit altitudes towards the upwind end of the runway. So it could be an area of potential conflict. So just being aware of who's lining up, what type of aircraft it is good. We're allowed to do base joins. It's probably not one of the recommended practices, simply because people can arrive right into the middle of the circuit pattern, and there's not a lot of time to organise separation when you do a base join. So certainly if you are planning on doing a base join, make sure that you're aware of the aircraft that are in the circuit and try and get that base join call out nice and early, that your intentions are to join base. A bit like a straight-in approach is probably pretty good practice. And then we've got the straight-in approach aircraft. There is some traffic priority in the regulations, and certainly someone who's established in the circuit has a right of way. But, for us IFR guys, we could have set up our approach from quite some distance away, and we're on a 10 or a 15 mile final. There's limited capacity there for us to adjust our circuits on arrival, and we'll certainly be looking out for people that turn base, but if there's any opportunity to assist each other in traffic management by extending a circuit leg, for example, and following us around, it certainly makes it a lot easier for us. And for the IFR guys that are out there on the call, if someone is in the circuit and you set up for a straight-in approach and it's looking likely that there's going to be a conflict, it might be that you just make a call nice and early that instead of continuing the straight-in approach, just track for an upwind join and pop into the circuit is a pretty good strategy for transitioning from a straight-in approach to facilitate any traffic that's already in the circuit ahead of you. The other area that we have conflict with pretty regularly, we've got some pretty high density traffic routes up here in the Kimberley especially, is the people climbing up to altitudes and the other aircraft need to descend through that track. So just being aware of your distance from the aerodrome can be a pretty handy tool, so that you guys can organise traffic separation. So probably the biggest areas of conflict that we see between IFR and VFR pilots is this join in the circuit and the inbound conflicts as well. Just a couple of tips for operating in the circuit. I think number one is probably to plan ahead. Make sure you've read the OSR. And that is to become familiar with the runways. Check your radio frequencies. And also check to see if you've got RFU and beatback, or if it's an RFU equipped aerodrome. So that can be a pretty good way of working out if there's anyone else in the circuit. If you jump onto frequency and it reads back the aerodrome, there probably hasn't been any traffic making a call for the last 5 minutes. But if you just get the beat back, it means it's a pretty good indication that there's already somebody in the circuit, and it might be something just to increase your monitoring of what other aircraft. Also, having to read it, making sure that we've got the correct circuit direction and the circuit altitude. Radio calls are probably one of the best ways for us to monitor other traffic and organise our own separation. As I discussed before, IFR pilots can be a bit guilty of not using really good simple radio calls, but yeah, the best way is just a compass point and a distance. Certainly that's something that everybody should be able to understand pretty on from the same point of view. Making sure we're including our circuit time. That's probably one of the key points that IFR pilots will use to help assess what they need to do when they're arriving at departing a circuit is your circuit time. So being as accurate as you can. We do fly a fair bit in the NT, and it's pretty regular that people use their local time for minutes rather than UTC, which can be a bit confusing. So just if you're operating somewhere that's not, it has half an hour UTC corrections, that I try and make sure that my watch is in UTC when I travel in those states, just to make sure that I don't make those mistakes. And if you can let people know what you're doing, it certainly helps us IFR pilots assess what we need to do quite early. So it might be that we decide not to do a practice approach. It might be that we decide to, instead of doing a straight-in approach, we track for a crosswind join, or put other plans in place to fit in with the traffic. But the earlier that we know what everyone's doing, the easier it is for us to fit in with that traffic flow.
Just a comment from the chat, Chris. It's also important to include aircraft type with your initial inbound call. It just gives an idea to everyone on frequency what type of speed or what type of performance to expect. It can be anything from a Jabiru all the way up to a King Air or a Cessna Citation, etc. So, yeah, that's also another little thing to do.
Absolutely, thanks, Marty. Sorry, Tim. Yep. So it certainly makes a big difference if we know what type of aircraft are inbound or outbound. I'm not sure what you've got in your local aerodromes, but Canada's got a pretty good mix of high-capacity jets to turboprops to smaller single pistons, private aircraft, helicopters of all sorts of different sizes.
Yeah, there's a big mix.
Float planes. Yeah, it certainly is.
Cool.
I just thought I'd have a quick chat about effective communication. You can see one cute little photo of the owls there. Probably one of the biggest areas that we've seen when there has been communication breakdown, because someone might not be on the correct frequency. So not all aerodromes are on 126.7, and so making sure that you've got the right volume set. If it's been a bit noisy and have switched one of your receivers off for some reason, good practice is to leave your fingers on it so you remember to turn it back on. But yeah, it's surprising how many people have been caught out, and I'll put my hand up and say that I've been caught out before as well by switching the radio off and forgetting to turn it back on and missing out on radio calls that we should have been receiving. And also checking what comm you've got your transmitter selected to. So you might be making all the world's best radio calls, but you're making it to the wrong frequency, and it doesn't help everyone else in the circuit out too much. Can get pretty busy listening out in the area, but it can be pretty good just to listen out on area, and you'll get some information on IFR arrivals and departures. It can be a bit hard to decipher all the traffic that's going through, but the more you practice, the more it'll make sense to you. We'll think about calls before you press the transmitter. It just says clogging up the radios by making sure you got clear and concise radio calls. Pretty important using standard phraseology or language. And we had a little chat already just about ARFU and making sure you know what the beatback means. And I guess the other benefit from the beatback is it just means that you know you've got the right frequency selected and that you're transmitting on the correct frequency. Probably one of the hardest things to do is to have enough situational awareness so that you know when somebody else is going to be a conflict for you. It doesn't mean that it's any aircraft in an aerodrome. I have a bubble that I work on. So if there's any aircraft that's going to be flying within about 5 miles or 1,000 feet above or below myself, that's when I start having heightened awareness of what that aircraft is doing. And that's probably when I'd start establishing two-way comms with that particular aircraft and just making sure that they know I'm here and they know what I'm doing and I know what they're doing so that we can sort something out before it becomes an issue.
Yeah, there was a comment a little bit earlier, Chris. Someone asked, if you're doing an inbound approach and they're in the circuit area, would you as the IFR person prefer to know about that person earlier or later?
Certainly the earlier we know about other aircraft in the circuit, the better. And we'll often start monitoring a CTAF well outside the 10 or 15 miles. We're normally listening from about 30 or 45 miles out, or earlier if you're expecting it to be busy, just to assess what's happening in the circuit, and to start building our picture of what our situational awareness for when we drop into that circuit area. Good question, though. Thank you, Marty. It might sound a bit contrary to jumping on the radio and talking to other aircraft when required, but also just making sure that we don't congest busy frequencies. The regs talk about making the required calls. There's no real mandatory calls required at the moment. Certainly AC 91-10 has some really good information. So I won't go into all of the recommended calls that they have in there, but it's a great place to look at sort of the minimum recommended calls to make. We don't have to making a call, turning base, turning final, at every stage of the circuit. We just need to make what's required to give other aircraft enough information to decide whether or not you're a conflict is probably the key. So the minimum as required. And then certainly if someone's a potential conflict, jumping on the radios nice and early and sorting it out and letting them know that in there makes it a lot easier from further out. We can adjust that time. We can adjust how we're going to join the circuit. Yeah, so the earlier the better as far as knowing what traffic's around. And finally, just a couple of quick separation strategies. If you do find yourself that you may be in conflict with another aircraft, we've all heard alerted, see and avoid. So if we know where to look and what someone's doing, it's a lot easier to spot that other person rather than just looking out in the big blue sky and waiting to see something. If you know where to look, that makes a huge difference. Communicating early is important. Letting other people know where you are and what you're doing. And also making a call early enough that someone can respond before it's too late. The old a pet peeve of mine is someone doing an entering and rolling call after they've already entered the runway. It's a bit late for someone on finals to have understood what's happening there. So make sure you get that call out early enough that someone could respond to you and then into the runway, join the circuit, etc. You might have someone about to join downwind from a different direction to yourself. So get that call in nice and early, and it'll certainly save further conflict. Probably one of the best ways to separate yourself from other aircraft is vertical separation. It's a lot easier to limit your climb or limit your descent and give someone 1,000 feet until you're clear than it is to horizontally or laterally separation of a certain amount of miles. So vertical separation's 99% of the time going to be the most effective way to separate yourself from other traffic, especially arriving and departing aircraft. Adjusting your speed can be a pretty good tool, and that requires good accurate circuit time estimates, and you can start slowing down nice and early if it's something that we do quite a lot to make sure that we give a minute or two space from someone who's ahead of us. Another good tip is to extend circuit legs. If we can extend that downwind just to make number 2 to an aircraft that's already established on a long final, it can certainly be a big help for us, especially if we're doing an approach. And probably one tip is have some sort of a reference to the airport distance handy, especially if you're departing So it's pretty easy to have your next waypoint up on the GPS, and we've got 45 miles to our next waypoint, and someone asks how far you are from your departure point, and it can be pretty hard to, sometimes if you're not ready for the call, it can take you a little while to find that information. So if you have that available for while you're departing, it can certainly help with the traffic separation. So I might stop my descent 1,000 feet above you until I know that you're further away than I am from the airfield, then I can continue my descent. Making your intentions known can be pretty important. If you're just doing a standard circuits join, it might not be a problem, but if you're planning to overfly and descend on the dead sides, that's pretty good information for IFR arrivals, just so they know what to expect. You might have a certain circuit time that you'll be over the top, but would probably be expecting you to go straight onto the into the circuit. And if you're not going to go straight into the circuit, if you just make sure that you let people know that what your intentions are, it certainly helps us adjust our separation standards. And the last one is be courteous. There's no point being right if you've had an accident or an incident. So yeah.
I think it's a big one, the be courteous. It doesn't take much time for whether it be a VFR or an IFR aircraft, like you say, extend a circuit leg just to be a little bit more courteous. And really, if by doing that, you then give yourself a little bit more time to set yourself up for a stable approach as well. So I definitely agree with that one there, Chris.
Yeah. There was... it's a little bit rude, but somebody at work had a little badge that said, "Don't be a 4-letter word," and that's generally the motto that I live by. It doesn't take much to extend a circuit or to slow down a little bit just to give space to somebody else. And I think you'll find with most IFR pilots, as long as they know where you are and what you're doing, they'll give you space to do what you need to do, and we'll work around you. But we just need to know what you're doing first and foremost. So, yeah, hopefully that's covered a few things for let people know a little bit about what it's like to fly as an IFR pilot and different ways that we might be able to work together just to make sure that we're all safe in the same airspace.
Lovely, Chris. Thank you so much, mate. The chat room's been going off. We've had heaps of comments and questions and bits and pieces going backwards and forwards. So it's certainly generated a lot of comment, and we do appreciate your expertise on that. So what I'll do now is I might get yourself, Marty, if you want to put your presentation up.
Thanks, Chris, very much. I appreciate, and hopefully please chime in on a couple of things that we might or I might talk about regarding sharing the air, and ultimately so we can understand the other pilots that we all operate with. So what I'll go through with my slides and my presentation is just making sure that in a situation like this, when we are sharing the air in non-controlled airspace, to make sure that we're all sort of speaking the same language or understanding that same language. We'll also go through and we'll clear up some confusion that arises between VFR and IFR pilots. And then we want to talk about the top things that a VFR pilot can do to be more aware and to make flying safer for all pilots, including IFR pilots. So just a little bit of a background and history on myself is I started to learn to fly back in 2004, and that was under a Class D airspace in Albury. So it was a real good mixture of controlled airspace and then flying into OCTA. I then finished my PPL in 2006 in the same place in Albury. Then I moved on and did a night rating down at Wangaratta in a non-controlled aerodrome. So that was great for me to build from controlled airspace to non-controlled. I then picked up work in 2007 and then started to do my instructor rating with RA Oz out of Narrandera in the regional New South Wales. I was fortunate enough to obtain my first twin rating and followed on with my CPL after a twin rating. Then 2013, I obtained my senior instructor rating, which gave me that little bit more responsibility, I say, with looking after our students as we go through. And I continued in the commercial world as well. So obtaining my multi-engine IFR in 2014. I was quite lucky to operate into a single engine turbine, one of the fastest in the world, the old TBM. And I was able to do a bit of simulator work with a light twin jet, the Mustang. And in 2020, obviously everything changed for a lot of us, me especially. But I was able to come on board as a CFI with a flight school in the Hunter Valley, and a lot of different experiences and so forth. And that also then led me to now working for RAOS as the assistant head of flight ops. And it's a role I'm really enjoying because I get to touch base with all our members. I get to fly with different people, fly in different airspaces, and I get to touch both worlds, the VFR, the IFR, and I just want to make it a safer place for all if we can. So let's have a look at the things a bit on situational awareness and bringing our minds back, if you are that IFR pilot, to how much you actually see when you've got that situational awareness. And so, first of all, the experienced pilot, they might see the whole, the dash, they'll see the windscreens, they'll see out the side ports, they understand their approach coming in, they've listened to the radio, they've got everything going on and a full understanding of position, even to the aircraft that's taking off. If you can see in that right-hand window there, they've already pictured everything there. And then we might come to the inexperienced pilot and to what they might be able to see. They're going to be that little bit more tunnel visioned. So we've got to kind of understand it, us as a VFR pilot, not just to fixate on one little item, just spread your eyes a little bit, take a breath so as you can actually see the bigger picture. If I run this little video for you here, I'll just confirm that I can. Just gives you a little bit of an insight to the idea of an inexperienced part in the top right-hand corner. Their vision is restricted compared to the more experienced pilot. Now, this is not to say that my senior instructor that's flying here with me is vision impaired or anything there. But I just want to give you that important factor that they might not be seeing that extra big picture. And that can come down to not only just a student, it could be just someone that's briefly got their certificate with RAOS or even their RPL with the CASA system. So none of us know what's going on in that next cockpit of that other aircraft. So that's where communication comes into it. And good, clear communication. So when we're broadcasting information like our position reports, you want to use basic compass positions. So maybe 10 nautical miles to the northeast, rather than that 10 nautical miles on the 050 radial. That one's a bit tricky for some people to understand. Are you to the northeast or are you to the southwest? So getting that understanding there, or if they're in an IFR waypoint like Wagga Echo India, and if you can see, I'm not sure if anyone can see on my map, but I might be able to point out a laser pointer here. We can see up here Echo, and then following along to Echo India, and that's then can build a picture for the VFR person to see where these aircraft are. What we'll go through to next is some key points that for the VFR pilot, what do you need to know? So if you're unsure about a radio call, an IFR aircraft, whether it be an RPT, Rex, Qantas or Bonza, they've given that inbound call, just to remember to, if you don't understand what they're saying, just ask them, say again in plain English. And I'm sure they're willing to come back to you because they've got the ability and the headspace. So be comfortable to do that. The next thing is for the IFR pilot, when you're broadcasting at that non-controlled aerodrome, remember to give that position report in relation to the compass, because not all VFR pilots will have that IFR plate showing up the Whiskey or Echo India or a position, okay? They might not even reference that in their training at all. I do recommend for VFR pilots, go back and see an instructor and ask them just to show you, especially if you're continuing to operate at a particular aerodrome. For myself, I'll show people in my local area out of the Cessnock area because we've got an approach point that leads straight into Maitland. So I like to sort of show people that this is where you might expect an IFR aircraft to be and what they're going to do. And with that being said, that the IFR pilot is quite predictable. It's the VFR us guys and girls that are a little bit unpredictable as we're going. Now, if you're looking at seeing what a straight-in approach, and Chris spoke earlier about that it's generally what they would like to do because it's a nice standard procedure. It can keep things fairly safe for them workload-wise, and it also saves on costs. But one thing I want to get from the VFR perspective, the pilot, to say to the IFR people is don't just assume, if you can, that right away into the circuit for the straight-in approach. What we'd probably prefer to see is that you may be asking, rather than just saying, yeah, we're established on a straight-in approach and you'll have to extend. Maybe just that asking can make that difference. I've been operating in the commercial world for over 10 years, so I do understand the commercial pressures, and also it's improved safety and it saves money. But it doesn't hurt, like Chris said, just to take your time and, be compassionate with your other aviators. Remember back in the early days, the overload of decision making and operating an aircraft. So what I'm trying to get at with this point is the idea that maybe a fresh VFR pilot is in that tunnel vision, and as soon as someone just says something or steps outside the box, that VFR pilot may not know exactly what to do. So give them a little bit of the benefit of doubt and talk to them, discuss it. As long as the airways aren't busy, it's simple enough to do. For the VFR pilots, I want you to be out there to say, don't be afraid to state your position. And if someone's called it there for a 10-mile final and you're just early downwind, maybe state that position, that you are early downwind and you think that there might be a conflict. So speak up early enough. It's probably not standard practice, but if you need to put it in plain English, do so, because if it's going to build safety, then why not stick with that? For the IFR pilots, that communication. So instead of stating that straight-in approach, confirm position in the traffic. Maybe you should be, because you're more advanced and been around a bit longer, is actually ask the other traffic, where are you, what time, think about their position. And maybe, like Chris said, they can slow up a little bit or set up for an upwind join rather than that straight-in approach. Now, what I do have is on this next slide is a bit of a VFR map with an overlay of the approach points. And you should be able to see up in the top right corner there that Wagga Echo Echo. And I'm just going to bring on two little aircraft, and you're going to have to excuse my playing. But I want to situate this, that we've got maybe an IFR aircraft tracking in via Echo Echo and the little VFR aircraft in the circuit pattern and not communicating, and they're not using that good situation awareness, and we end up in a situation where we kind of probably don't want to be. And so that's sort of a key point. How could we fix this? So let's go with maybe a different scenario, and perhaps this time both aircraft actually start communicating early, as Chris said. And at that point, the VFR person might have already said, hey, look, I'll extend my downwind and then join base number 2 to you. So maybe use that communication skills. And a last one, or a way that could happen here, is just that little bit different, where the IFR aircraft may actually give way, and they might just say that they'll join upwind rather than continuing their approach, and then follow in their circuit pattern, and then everything works out nicely. So just wanting to bring in just a couple of different scenarios there for people to work with and feel comfy. And the biggest part of it all is that idea, that communication. So good communication and good situational awareness, and we all get to go home safe at the end of the day. I suppose I can finish off with it, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I might just add to that, if that's all right. Good communication is sometimes making sure that the other person has heard and understood your message. So just because you've made a radio call doesn't necessarily mean they've heard it and have understood it. So don't be scared to check that you've got that two ways communication going in that circumstance. You know, they might have been busy on the other radios and missed your call or didn't comprehend the significance of it.
Yeah, I really agree there. And another thing too, I hear a lot of VFR pilots might say, well, let's not just say VFR pilots, but some pilots will say to me, wow, that person, I don't know what they just said, because they said it so fast. They rattled it out like a machine gun. And it's probably how I'm talking through this presentation. It can come down to the fact of just slowing up that radio call so we all understand it. One thing I do see in the instructing world is sometimes the instructors that get to that point, they get a bit of experience up, and they're doing a bit like Tom Cruise, and they're rattling it off really quick. It's the idea is just slow it down, take a breath, and then deliver the message that needs to be delivered. So, and yeah, definitely that communication there, Chris. I agree. From that, I hope everyone does enjoy this, and I think with the idea that if we've got time, we can work through. I'll talk with Tim if we can work through the questions and go from there. I'll just stop sharing on my behalf, team.
Thanks, Marty. We're just about done. We've had a lot of discussion today, so that's been really cool. And I'm just going to, just wrap it up. As I said earlier, the chat room's been going gangbusters, and lots of comment, mostly comment. Everything from wake turbulence to use of technology in the cockpit, all sorts of stuff going on that we need to consider. People not using, waypoints like Fred's Farm or something like that. Think about the audience that are likely to be on frequency. And someone just put on something about training area. Don't just say tracking to the training area. Someone not from that area might not know where the training area is. Again, just keep it simple. Give a quadrant, give a distance, give a height and intentions. It's reasonably simple. So just to wrap up before we finish, look, I hope we've found out over the last hour that both sides of the fence have their own unique challenges. They certainly do. The other thing that we just want you to take away with is think about other pilots in the vicinity and what will help them best to keep you both safe. Let's try and make it as safe and as simple as possible for the other people that we share the air with, and be as predictable as possible by as far as practicable following those standard procedures. The last webinar, I emphasized the importance of making our flying predictable. So tell people who you are, what you are, where you are, and what you're doing. Phraseology, think about the audience that's likely to be on the other end of the radio. Use language able to be understood by that person. And ask yourself always, what sort of aircraft are likely to be in the vicinity? That's just good basic risk management 101. And always keep in mind that bigger picture. How can I integrate with other traffic and not become an additional hazard for them to manage? Remember, we don't fly in our own little bubble, and no one is actually an island in all of this. So that's just a quick kind of summary of where we got to over the last hour. I certainly hope everyone has found that of use. Please jump onto CASA's Pilot Safety Hub. In there, you'll find all sorts of information. There's webinars, there's podcasts, there's presentations, and all sorts of information and articles, both for you to read and also to listen to and to watch. And we certainly will be back again soon with further webinars. If you believe that this is the type of thing that is going to add value to your flying, please drop in the chat room on the right-hand side any other topics that perhaps you'd like to see us work with over the coming weeks and months. Again, a big thanks to Chris from Aviation up in Kununurra. Thank you, Chris, for your expertise and joining us today, and also Marty
Thanks,
in the
Tim.
Hunter Valley from RAOZ. Thank you, Marty. Really good
You're
to just get everyone in the same sandpit talking and swapping information. Hopefully, everyone got to take some really good info away today, and we thank everyone for being with us. We'll go through the chat room, of course, and if there's any outstanding questions, we will certainly get back to you over the coming days. All the best, everyone. Safe flying, and I hope it's exactly what you wanted to hear today. I think it was a really good event. See you next time. Bye.
See you all.
Thanks for attending, guys. Appreciate it.